So in 1896, Wilfrid Laurier became the Prime Minister of Canada. He was tall, good-looking, very eloquent speaker in both French and English. He had a slight Scots accent when he spoke English. And he was very rouge, red, referring to his Parti Rouge roots, meaning he was liberal. And he took his liberalism with him into public office. He saw liberalism as a set of clear principles. His definition of liberalism shaped his party and transformed it into the dominant institution of the Canadian political scene. Laurier had to define where his party stood because of the opposition of the Catholic Church, inspired by the very conservative Pope Pius IX, to political liberalism, which Pius considered to be one of the great errors of the modern age. Laurier rejected this and adopted liberalism very fervently. And by liberalism, in his sense, I think we can mean he was a reform-minded progressive who engaged with modernity rather than rejected it. Despite being nominally Catholic and a Francophone, he loved England. He said that England was the model that Canada should follow, that liberal reforms had made the English the freest of peoples, prosperous and happy. And so he was glad to be part of the British model. That did not mean he had to love the Anglais of Canada. He was well aware of these deep sectarian tensions and national animosities. He hoped to transcend them, but realistically he settled for avoiding them as much as possible. And this is where his famous compromise position comes in. Laurier prized local autonomy for Canada inside the British Empire and for the provinces inside Canada. He understood provincial power and prized provincial rights and may indeed have been the most decentralized politician to hold the job of Canadian Prime Minister. His victory in the 1896 election was as much the result of provincial grievances against the federal government as it was a repudiation of a very elderly conservative administration. He put three provincial premiers into his cabinet. His cabinet was much younger. I know this picture of it doesn't look young, but trust me, it was younger than the geriatric cabinet that preceded it. Laurier in 1877 had stressed development, and it is a term that needs some explanation. Laurier and his generation of politicians saw Canada as a young country. The image most often propagated at the time was either a youthful but virtuous young woman, Our Lady of the Snows, as the imperial poet Rudyard Kipling put it, or a strong young man, also virtuous and promising but not fully developed. Canada, in Laurier's view, needed time and space to become mature and prosperous. The prospects of Canada are great, in the words of an enthusiast of the time, but they were prospects not yet realized, and Canada needed to be left alone to take advantage of them. When it came to economics, Laurier was an optimist, like most of his fellow citizens, and that was undoubtedly part of his electoral appeal. He was also lucky, for his arrival in power coincided with an economic upturn in prosperity. Transportation costs fell, giving better access to the European market, better methods of cultivation, including the Marquis wheat. The arid and frost-prone Canadian plains suddenly became attractive. Laurier's government turned to advertising to attract settlers, although they didn't really need to. There were a lot of Slavs, Ukrainians, and other people from Central and Eastern Europe that came to the plains to homestead. So many so that the government had to carve out two new provinces, Saskatchewan and Alberta. And although there was virtually no one on the plains at the beginning of this era, by 1911, Saskatchewan had the third biggest provincial population behind Ontario and Quebec. Meanwhile, the proportion of Francophones in the country was declining. Most people coming in, even to Quebec, would eventually speak English. And although no one came from France, of course, or none to speak of, and although the Quebecois generally had a higher fertility rate, probably because of their Catholicism, that was offset by high infant mortality rates and disease generally. In addition to the rise in population, the amount of land under cultivation for wheat also improved exponentially. Until 1900, Canada had lagged far behind other wheat producers like the U.S., Argentina, Australia, and now, economically, Canada was no longer a colonial backwater. 1890, wheat acreage was 2.7 million acres. In 1911, it was 11 million. Huge change. Now, the arrival of new varieties of immigrants were not limited to the prairie. It was the best-known destination of immigration, but not the only one. The industrial cities of Canada also received hundreds of thousands of migrants. Virtually all Canadian urban areas grew in population, with Winnipeg growing the fastest. Montreal, the largest city, received the most and the most visible immigrants, turning for example, the St. Lawrence Boulevard area, called the Main, into what was effectively the city's Jewish quarter. So with immigration rose diversity. And these new immigrants strained Canadians' sense of tolerance, which wasn't strong to begin with. That tolerance did not extend to Asian immigrants, who were discouraged by a series of ingenious and onerous burdens. The Chinese by a head tax, the Japanese through a quota agreed to with the Japanese government, East Indians, they were referred to, which means people from the Indian subcontinent, by impossible conditions on travel. To manifest local sentiment, troublemakers in Vancouver staged an anti-Japanese riot in 1907, and it had its effect, especially on nervous politicians thinking ahead to the next election. Blacks from the United States were also discouraged. Canada was obviously, but unofficially, white. Mineral production also increased. Its most spectacular manifestation was the last great of the great gold rushes in the Canadian Klondike in the newly organized Yukon Territory. Gold was discovered near Dawson in 1896, and by 1898, an estimated 100,000 miners, or would-be miners, were packing their bags and heading for the Yukon, either overland or more usually by sea through American-owned Alaska. Alaska had a nice little boom as a result of this. Now, luck led to optimism, and optimism to confidence where Laurier was concerned. Laurier, he was now Sir Wilfrid Laurier as of 1897 when he was knighted, met the new century with another election victory in November 1900 and a mandate to carry on with the development of the country. What the country needed, in the Prime Minister's opinion, was more settlers, and to entice them, he prescribed railways. Laurier extended the Intercolonial Railway and also proposed, most famously, a second Canadian transcontinental railroad line. He had his own ideas about this. It should start not in Montreal, but in Quebec City, further north, which was Laurier's own political base. It should cut across central Quebec to northern Ontario with the hope of opening up that territory to development, perhaps settlement, as had happened in the rest of Ontario with rail development. But frankly, this didn't make a lot of economic sense. It was sort of the railroad to nowhere. But Laurier was adamant it would happen, and it did. Now, there was no profit, but rather depression and war, just as the lines were nearing completion. Laurier's two favorite projects, both the Grand Trunk Pacific and the Canadian Northern, went bankrupt, leaving the investors with nothing. And Canada, with a network of steel that could never hope to repay the money, let alone the hopes of those who'd paid for it. Many years later, Canadian newspapers still carried the occasional letter from the bilked British investor pleading for justice. There was only one way out of this: nationalization. The government should take over the railroads, and it did. Long before the Canadian government reached that particular conclusion, however, Laurier was out of office. He could console himself that he was not out because of his railway policy. That was too tangled for electors to even, frankly, figure out. Now, as the railway experience indicated, Canada in the 1900s was still an outpost of British capital, but it was also becoming a source of capital investment in its own right. There were some large, powerful banks in Canada. America did not have a branch banking system. Banks could only have one location. That would change in the 1930s. Canada did allow branch banking, so their banks were few in number but very, very large and powerful. There was a central bank, though banking was made the definite responsibility of the Dominion government in the British North America Act. The governments, MacDonald's and Laurier's and those in between, relied on advice and funding from Canada's banks to keep the dollar steady and the economy ticking over. In a financial panic in 1907, for example, it was the Bank of Montreal that told Laurier what to do and on whom Ottawa relied. Canadian investors very early began moving abroad, and the banks followed the investors, especially in the Caribbean and Latin America. Connection already existed between the maritime provinces and the British and Spanish colonies in the Caribbean. Spain retained Cuba and Puerto Rico until 1898, and not just through fish trade, but through sugar as well. Canadian banks established utilities companies, railways, and mines, and extended the banking system. The Royal Bank of Canada and the Bank of Nova Scotia, both Halifax companies, became dominant features in the financial districts of Havana and other cities. Money also flowed into Canada from other countries for investment, mostly British and American. And the two were very different. The British basically made loans. They bought bonds to finance various giant projects. What the Americans did, however, was actually invest directly in owning factories, for example. There was the Canadian General Electric, was usually assumed to be a branch of the General Electric of the United States, but it was in fact owned in Canada until the 1920s. Over time, in some industries, American investors did buy out Canadians who had originally been their partners. This was the case with new automobile companies such as Ford and General Motors, located in southern Ontario, close to their American parents over the border in Detroit. So America, unlike Britain, didn't just lend money. It carefully entangled its economy with that of Canada.